Stress. We all experience it, and for the most part, we wish we had less of it in our lives. But what if we looked at it and understood stress differently? What if we could use stress in new and effective ways to help us and our teams reach our goals? We'll explore those questions and more in today's important and inspirational show. Welcome to another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast, where we are helping leaders grow personally and professionally to lead more effectively and make a bigger difference for their teams, organizations, and the world. If you are listening to this podcast in the future, you could join us live. And to get information about how to do that, you can join our LinkedIn or Facebook groups to get the inside scoop, as well as the schedule for when upcoming live episodes, live streams will occur. Join our Facebook group by going to remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook or our LinkedIn group at remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn. Pretty simple. Do that, and then you'll get all the info and you can join us. Today's episode is brought to you by my upcoming book, the second edition of The Long Distance Leader, Revised Rules for Remarkable Remote and Hybrid Leadership. If you lead a team that is distributed in any way, this book will give you new skills, insights, and the confidence to lead more effectively in the new world of work. You can learn more and pre-order your copy today at remarkablepodcast.com/LDL, remarkablepodcast.com/LDL. Hope you'll do that. And now I'm going to introduce my guest. I'm going to bring him in here. And there he is. And then I'm going to introduce him for you. If I can get my screen to work. There we go. With me today is Dr. Stein. He's a world-renowned clinical psychologist, an international best-selling author and sought-after speaker, and the founder and executive chair of Multi-Health Systems, a publisher of scientifically validated assessments for over 40 years, which has been named a three-time winner of the Profit 100 fastest-growing companies in Canada, one of Canada's best managed companies since 2013, and Canada's 10 most admired corporate cultures in 2016. This guy is a practitioner and a leader. He is and a researcher. He's a leading expert on psychological assessment and emotional intelligence. He has consulted with military and government agencies across Canada and the U.S., including the FBI Academy, as well as corporate organizations like American Express, Air Canada, Canyon Ranch, Coca-Cola Mexico, and professional sports teams. He's also worked with all sorts of reality TV shows, which we might get to or not. He has co-authored this book that we're going to talk about today, Hardiness, Making Stress Work for You to Achieve Your Life Goals. He's also the author of The EQ Leader and Emotional Intelligence for Dummies. He co-authored the international bestseller, The EQ Edge, Emotional Intelligence and Your Success, and wrote Make Your Marketplace Great, 7 Keys to an Emotionally Intelligent Organization. Today, he's our guest here. Stephen, thanks for joining me.
Nice to be with you, Kevin.
Lots of good stuff for us to talk about. I really kind of want to start, like we've all gotten a bit of a background on you from that bio, and we had people joining us and following the rules that I gave, which is to tell us where you're located. Thank you, Jessica. But what I really want to do, Stephen, is really have you start by sort of telling us a little bit about your journey. How do you end up doing this work around EQ and around hardiness and stress? Like, how do you end up doing this work?
Wow. Well, that's, I'll try and give you the shorter version of that story. So I came out of grad school as your typical clinical psychologist, working in a children's treatment center. And at that time, something brand new came out called computers, microcomputers, by a couple of guys in California named Steve. And what was happening was I was doing some work with kids in the treatment center. We were doing a research study, and I had to do pre-test and post-test to see if the treatments worked. And none of the kids wanted to do, in fact, they would throw my tests at me and say, take this and shove it wherever. So what happened was I saw they liked these computers. So I brought in a computer, had a kid program or someone program it, and we started doing diagnostic assessments on the computer, and the kids loved it. I actually had some kids lining up asking me if I had any more tests for them to take. So
because they got to play on the computer.
Yeah,
right?
It was great. Yeah, but I got the data that I needed for the research. So I thought, wow, this is great. And then I published some research showing that we discovered more stuff about these kids in a 1-hour computer interview than like 10 therapists who had interviewed them and taken history. You know, they never told them about the sexual abuse they experienced. They never told them about the drugs they were taking. So there are a lot of things that they wouldn't really confess to the therapist, but they did to the computer. So I said, wow, this is amazing. It's going to change the world. So I want to pursue this in a research vein, but the hospital said, no, we're not interested in that. So I ended up, my wife was on maternity leave. She was working in an addiction center. And we ended up setting up a little company on our own and doing it at nights. So it was the two of us programming some of these tests. And lo and behold, we grew into a company that now has over 200 employees. But the emotional intelligence component, we started with the typical clinical stuff. And I spent a long time, you know, working with people who are anxious or depressed or schizophrenic or even psychopathic, like all kinds of weird psychological disorders. And it came to a point when I thought, you know what? I spent a lot of my time looking at what's wrong with people. Why don't we start looking at what's right with people? So I started studying people who were really successful, who were doing well in life, whether they were athletes, whether they were performers, whether they were CEOs, top salespeople, from a whole gamut of occupational groups. And that led me to emotional intelligence. That's when we got into the factors that we use to measure emotional intelligence. And we've measured several millions of people since we started doing that over 20 years ago.
So I opened the show. We got a little feedback for the first time, even though we were together for a while earlier. So I opened the show by talking about the word stress, which is the second word in the subtitle of the book, and it's sort of the title of this episode. So all of us experience stress. All of us have thoughts about what it is and what it isn't. What do we all need to know from you about stress? Like, most of us have some misconceptions. So what do we need to know about stress that you can tell us?
Well, there's a few things. One is that it's natural. If we're human, we're going to experience stress, right? So it doesn't really have to be your enemy unless you let it be your enemy. And what we're finding, and a lot of the research that's being done in this area, is finding that stress actually has a purpose in our lives. It's there for a reason, not to drive us crazy or make us insane. It's really there as a warning, as a signal, as something to help us. And what we've also learned is that the people who deal the best with stressful situations, difficult people, difficult things at work, are those who know how to sort of manage it or transform it, which is what we talk about in the book. We talk about the 3 C's. And learning how to use those skills just turns it around and makes it something else. You're not going to get rid of it. You know, you can relax all you want. You can count to 10 all you want. You can do all those things, which are wonderful things, right? But they're not going to get rid of your stress. So let's work with it and use it to get us to the next level.
So, Stephen, I didn't realize this till you and I were chatting before we started. Usually when I have guests, they have new books, right? This book came out but back when Corona was still a beer, like pre-COVID. So, you know, in the time since then, there's been a heightened awareness, a lot more discussion about mental health. And you talk about that later in the book, and I really don't want to make that the focus of our conversation. But since I opened with that word stress, do you have any thoughts for us? Like as a clinical psychologist, having seen what's happened in the world and how people are thinking about talking about mental health now, what would you say to us all as it relates to this conversation?
Well, you know, it's kind of an irony as we've done more research and more science over the years, like tons. I think I cite at the time I wrote the book, the number of scientific papers on stress. And the reality is it's getting worse. We're finding our kids are getting worse. We're finding people at work are getting more stressed out. So what's going on if we know so much more about it? We've done all of this research and people are just suffering all over the place. Now, there's a lot of work looking at kids and the influence of smartphones on kids' anxiety and stress. And that's getting pretty well established how that works. And we're looking at adults and the way that they are sort of managing their lives and the things that are causing them to be out of sorts with stress.
So even though this book came pre-COVID, and as you told me, there's no COVID stories in it, I think there's lots of lessons for us here. And so let's talk about this word that is the title of the book, hardiness. Uh, what do you mean by it specifically?
So hardiness, my co-author is the real expert on the area of hardiness. It's a term that was started in this area about 25 years ago at University of Chicago. And the research they were doing was with organizations. So the psychologists were looking at executives and how they manage stress, essentially. And it was a typical sort of psychologist study looking at people and their ability to manage stress. And in the middle of the study, there was an amalgamation going on. It was a company in the telecommunication industry. And as a result of that merger or acquisition, a lot of the people got let go from their jobs. And it just happened to affect a lot of the people that were being studied for the research, right? So they didn't want to stop the research, but what they noticed was something really interesting during that process. There were a number of people, maybe 80 to 90% of them, who were really upset, really angry, just, angry at the company, angry at their boss, angry at all kinds of people. They were not adapting well to losing their job. On the other hand, there were about 10% of them who had a completely different way of looking at it. They said, well, you know what? This may give me a new opportunity. I've always wanted to open a bakery and, make bread or sell muffins or something. Or they said, you know what? I was really getting tired of this organization. This is a perfect opportunity to dust up my resume and start looking for other places to work. So it was this really interesting difference. So they started there and started looking at what's going on. What's the mindset of these two different groups of people? And that led to over 25 years of research. We've got tons of data now in all different groups, really solidifying what they started to find, which was that there was three sort of ways of thinking, three mindsets that contributed to doing well while under stress. And yeah, we call them the 3 C's of hardiness.
And we'll get to those, but I'm curious, and I'm guessing that some people who are listening might be thinking this. They might be saying, Stephen, this sounds a lot like grit, or this sounds a lot like resilience, 2 words that have sort of blown up in the popular psyche in the last 10 years or so. How is hardiness the same or different than those other 2 ideas?
So it's there's a significant difference between hardiness and grit. So grit is really, putting your nose to the grindstone and plowing ahead and plowing ahead. So suppose, I'm a musician, I'm a saxophone player. Suppose I want to be John Coltrane.
You better get started.
I have grit, right? I'm going to go. I'm going to spend my whole life trying to be that saxophone player. Guess what? It ain't going to happen, right? It just isn't going to happen. And the problem with grit is you keep chasing a goal, even though you may not be able to achieve it. In hardiness, one of the C's that we talk about has to do with really shifting gears, dealing with change and saying, hey, you know what? I'm not going to be the greatest saxophone player, but maybe I can play in a local band. Maybe I can teach saxophone. Maybe I can be a studio musician. There are other things I can do with that same skill. And just another thing that I think I cite some of this in the book, there's been some new research in the area of grit. And if you're really high on grit, Kevin, I'll tell you one thing, don't go to casinos, because people high on grit lose their money. They don't stop. They keep playing, right? And the other study that came out looking at people high in grit is when it comes to mountain climbing, they're the most likely to die, because they won't come back down when the conditions start getting really bad. They just keep pushing through saying, I'm going to make it. So grit has some benefits, but it also has some serious downfalls. So that's one of the main differences between what we look at as hardiness versus grit.
Cool. Thank you. So you've mentioned it, and this is really what I wanted to make the cornerstone of our conversation, are the 3 C's of hardiness. So why don't you mention the 3 just sort of at a high level, and then we'll chat about each of them a little bit.
Okay. So the first one is commitment, which has to do with having a purpose in life. The second one is control, knowing what I can control and what I can't control. And the third one we call challenge, which is looking at what can I learn from even a bad situation when I go through one, is challenge.
So the basic idea here is that all of us have all three of these in our lives. It's sort of how we use, think about, and shape them that has an impact then on how we transform stress into hardiness. Is that a fair way to say it?
Absolutely, yeah. And sort of one other point, you mentioned resilience. So differentiating from resilience, when we look at resilience, it's usually we go through something difficult and then we bounce back to where we were. What we find with people high in hardiness who train in hardiness, they don't come back to where they were. They come back even stronger than they were. And I'm sure you've seen this. Some people call it post-traumatic growth, but it's that concept that I've learned from a difficult situation and I can use that to do better the next time.
So I'm very well aware that when people are listening to us or even watching us, it isn't, not everyone's watching us in this moment. At this moment, we're in the end of July of 2024. So the Olympics are on. And so as I was reading the book, I was thinking about the fact that watching the Olympics, listening to some of the backstories of some of the athletes, you see all three of these things playing out. So I don't want to overdo that because so many people are going to be watching this long after that took place. But is any comment that you want to make just about that in general before we dive into the 3 C's?
Yeah, I mean, if you're interested in how it applies to athletes, I actually have a section in the book with a tennis player. It was a fascinating story about this young woman who at a young age determined that she wanted to win the US Open. And I spent some time with her coach learning about, because I figured the coach really has the story, the inside story of how she trained, where she was at the beginning and so forth. And we talk about that in terms of both the 3 C's and some of the techniques that he used with her to get her to actually beat Serena Williams and win. Her name is Bianca Andreescu, and she won the US Open a few years back. So it's a really interesting story, and I've talked to other athletes and worked with other athletes. So if you want to learn about some of the techniques such as visualization and one of the reasons I learned that, or I spend time with athletes, is because I think we can take from that world and apply it to the business world. We can use some of those same techniques when we have to make a presentation, do a sales call, and so on.
Yeah, I love that, and I agree with that. So I want to talk. You just said something I think it's really important. Most people listening are probably thinking about, how do I think about these 3 C's? How do I think about this conversation as it relates to me? You just said, Stephen, hey, I worked with a coach who was coaching the athlete and thinking about what the coach did. So as you're listening to the rest of this conversation, I want you to be thinking about this with 2 hats on, both the personal hat and your leadership hat, right? And so, Stephen, feel free to sort of cross between the 2 of those as we go. Let's talk a little bit more about the commitment piece. In short, the higher our level of commitment, the hardier we will be, right?
Yeah. So, yeah, commitment really means being invested in the world, having an interest in what's going on around you, and having a purpose in your own life. We find that leaders who are really successful in managing their way through stressful situations have a greater purpose. They're not ripped down by small, obstacles that get in the way here and there, but they say, hey, this is where we really ultimately want to go. This is our purpose, and can deliver that purpose to the team and to the people reporting to them. So commitment is really all about having that purpose, having that drive and desire to get to that purpose.
If we realize for ourselves that, and like I coach people who sometimes are saying, like, I just don't feel that like I once did. I don't have that sense of purpose or commitment that I once had. What are a couple of things that people could do, or that we could do, to help others sort of rediscover that?
Yes, I like to explore with them. So what are your interests? What are your hobbies? What are the things that get you excited? What got you excited in your job in the first place? Like, what took you on that path to that? You're in engineering, you're in plumbing, or whatever. What was it that you liked about that? And if we could sort of get that initial spark, what is it that you really, and it may have changed, right? Oh, I want to be an engineer. I expected to do this, but now I got all this paperwork and I got bosses I can't stand and I got blah, blah, blah. How do we take you back to those original things to working with your hands, or to working with people and spending more time talking to people and less time writing it up. So we look at, how do we get you excited about the thing that really drove you in the first place?
And sort of refining that, or reframing that. I think that's exactly right. And we can help others with that. We can help ourselves with that as well. And so that's the first C, commitment. You talked about the next one as being control. So this one, to me, in my work as a leader, I find that this one is a huge one, because there's so much that's mindset related and sort of belief related for people around control. So talk about this one a little bit, because I think that this is a really big lever, everybody, as you listen to Stephen here.
Yeah, because a lot of times things happen and we take on responsibility for it. And it may be something that we have no control over, right? There's someone else did something or whatever. So what it means here is really learning what it is you have control over and what is beyond your control, or what else somebody else can help you with in terms of that particular situation. A lot of people just get out of joint and spin their wheels trying to change the weather, right? When you can't change the weather, it's just going to rain whether you can dance all you want. It might change it.
Carry an umbrella, but you're not going to change it. It's going to rain.
A lot smarter getting an umbrella, because that's within your control, right? That's what you can do. And we see so many times that there are situations that come up and you worry and spend so much time problem solving the uncontrollables. Whereas if you come up with some solutions like getting the umbrella in the workplace, you'll be able to deal with it much more effectively. So it's a way of thinking about situations, whereas that I'm not managing, I'm not in charge of everything in the world, but these are the areas that I am in charge in, and I can make a difference with those areas.
I think for leaders, this is especially, well, let me put it this way. For new leaders, it's one of the biggest challenges that people face, because they got promoted to being a leader because they were a really good individual contributor. Like they got stuff done, and we typically have more control over doing that report, creating that design, having that phone call, making that sale, all that stuff. But now we're leading people that are doing that work, and we don't have the kind of, or the type of control that we had before, and getting clearer about this and recognizing what's in our control. And it's a lot, control and influence, but recognizing what's not, like the weather, like gravity, like time, right? Like is a huge piece for us. And I think, and I find that leaders often really struggle with this one, and they can't even see this is a blind spot.
Absolutely. They want to micromanage, right? Because this is the way I did it, or I've been doing that job for so long, and you have to do it this way. And the micromanage, there may be new ways of doing things. There may, we should be looking at outcomes, not a process. So it's a huge area, especially when you go a new leader into that position. Learning how to step back. You can influence, your control becomes influence. How do you influence that person? And you can do that by just asking questions. Hey, how do you think that's going to work out for us? Is that the best way? Have you looked at other ways of doing this? Okay, great. Just being helpful and being a good coach.
Yeah, I love that. And the third C is challenge. And it comes down to how we frame a challenge has a huge impact here. So talk about challenge as a component of, and a way to help us be hardier, if you will.
Yeah, so this one really, this one's a harder one. You got to really work at it to get it right. But, when things are crappy, they're crappy. I lose a major sale, I'm going to be upset about it. But if I'm good at challenge, at least I can say, okay, what did I learn from this? What can I take away? This has been a bad situation. I'm not going to beat myself over the head, 100 times, 100 lashes. I'm going to look at the situation realistically and say, okay, what's the gain? What can I learn? Where can I improve the next time? And people who are high in challenge are good at that. They can shift. They can, feel bad, get through that feeling of losing something or a bad situation, but they can turn it around relatively quickly by starting to think in a more positive way and a constructive way. By what did I learn? What can I do? And move forward. And we see this again. We learn so much from athletes because they're performing constantly, and they're in front of a huge, you know, when you and I make a mistake, I don't know, maybe 3 people see it, but you know, you're talking about the Olympics, you're talking about like millions of people seeing their mistake. You could really, and I've seen it where they really get down on themselves. But if you have that challenge, you're able to come away from that situation and still feel good about yourself.
Yeah. So how we frame it, really in all 3 of these, but certainly these second 2, it's a huge piece of this. So before we start to wrap up, I want to talk about the connection between hardiness and stress, and a little more directly with what you and Paul call the hardy stress response. So talk about that a little bit before we start to close up here.
Okay, so basically this is all about a mindset, a way of approaching situations. Something happens, where do we go? Where do we start? There's questions we would ask ourselves in terms of dealing with the situation. How will this affect me in the long run? What can I learn from this? What can I manage? What's beyond my control? What's within my control? And where does this fit into my game plan overall? Is this going to, you know, hurt my ability to ultimately be a senior level leader or whatever it is I have for the goals? So it really comes to a series of questions and analysis that you do, and hopefully you'll start doing it before the stress hits you. So when it does come, you inoculated yourself, basically. You've inoculated yourself so you can feel the stress, but get through it much more quickly than you otherwise would have.
We're talking with Stein, co-author of the book Hardiness. And before we finish, I have a couple of other things I like to ask everybody, Stephen. And the first one is, you've hinted at this twice, so I think I might know your answer. But what do you do for fun?
Well, I do a few things for fun. I play tennis, which is an athletic thing that I do, but I'm also a saxophone player, right? So I'm a musician and I have a band. I have a jazz rock band, and we perform once a month in a local bar. We play tunes of the rock band group Chicago, and we do Amy Winehouse, and I love music, right? And I get to perform and have a group of friends, and that's real teamwork. You want to learn about team? Run a band. I have a 12-piece band, and that's that's a lot of fun, and we all like each other and have a blast.
So 2 questions. So you're the band leader and not just the sax player.
Oh, I wouldn't say I'm the band leader. I'm not the best musician of the group. We have someone who's a really good musician who came out of the Berklee School of Music, who does our arranging and leads the music part of it. I'm more in charge of booking gigs and doing those kinds of things.
And then also as a former, I'll say former sax player, tenor or alto?
In the band, I'm baritone.
Oh, Barry sax.
I love the Barry sax.
Listen, I was a freshman in high school, and I was only a little taller than the Barry sax, I suppose, and I marched with the baritone saxophone. Why? They didn't let me march with my tenor or an alto. I don't know, but I marched with the Barry sax, played it for some period of time.
Well, that's great. We're on the same wavelength. That's amazing.
There you go. We're both wearing blue shirts for all of you that are only hearing us later. So the only thing, Stephen, that you knew I would ask is this: like, what are you reading these days? What's something that you're reading or have recently read that you would share with all of us?
So one of the things I'm partly through is the book about Elon Musk by Walter Isaacson. I guess he's a pretty big figure in the world these days. And as a psychologist, I find his growing up really interesting, where he came from and how he ended up the way he is today. And maybe down the road, that'll be a good analysis for how hardiness fit into his life.
Could be. So now the question you most wanted me to ask all along, like, where can we learn more about your work, about your assessments, about the book, about any of the books? Like, where do you want to point us? Where can we learn more about you?
You can go to my website, stephenstein.com. And to learn about the assessments that we develop, you go to mhs.com. So pretty simple to reach either way, and you'll find me there.
mhs.com, Stephen with a V, Stein.com. I hope you'll check those out and get your copy of Hardiness, Making Stress Work for You to Achieve Your Life Goals. I think this has been an episode that has focused on both us individually as leaders, as well as our role as a leader. And hopefully you've taken something from all that. So before I say a final thank you to Stephen. And before I say goodbye to all of you, I will ask you the question I ask every episode, which is now what? What action will you take as a result? There's at least one question that you heard that's in the back of your head now that you've listened to this conversation. Make sure you answer that question. Maybe there's something about one of the 3 C's, commitment, control, or challenge, that is gnawing at you or encouraging you to think more about. Or maybe you've gotten a bit of self-awareness today about something that might be helpful. Or maybe you've gotten an idea that might help you in coaching one of your team members. Whatever it is, leaving it as an idea is only of limited value in comparison to taking action on it. I hope that you will do that. If you do that, this will be a far more useful, a better use of the time that you've just spent with us. Stephen, thank you so much for being here. It was a pleasure to have you.
Thanks for having me. Great to be talking with you, Kevin.
And so everybody, I hope you found this useful. If you did, make sure you set yourself up with whatever podcast platform you're listening to, so you come back and join us again. If you've been here before, make sure you invite someone else, encourage someone else to join us in the future, because next week we'll be back again with another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast.